Why did they come? The air left my lungs as I stepped outside my hut at dawn and froze. 53 lions surrounded my small compound, their amber eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Just 20 feet away lay Bahati, the injured male I had treated yesterday, still breathing but motionless. The pride had found him and me. My mind raced through every wildlife management protocol I'd learned in my 12 years as a conservationist, but nothing prepared me for this moment. I was completely encircled by apex predators with nowhere to run. My name is Malik Ower, and until 3 years ago, I'd spent my entire life in Nairobi. The concrete jungle of Kenya's capital was my home, where I worked as a veterinary assistant at the animal clinic near Karen. I'd always felt drawn to wildlife, but my knowledge came from textbooks and the occasional school trip to Nairobi National Park. My life changed when I inherited my grandfather's modest property on the outskirts of the Masai Mara National Reserve. The elders said he'd asked specifically for me to take over his home and continue his work, though what exactly that meant remained unclear until I arrived. Grandfather's property sat on 5 acres of land, a small compound with a traditional mud-walled, thatch-roofed main house and 2 smaller structures. One served as a storage shed, the other I would later transform into a makeshift clinic. The nearest village was 4 miles away, and my closest neighbors were a Maasai family who lived a mile eastward. This isolation initially terrified me, having grown accustomed to the constant buzz of city life. When I arrived, Thomas, an elderly Maasai man who had worked alongside my grandfather, greeted me, his weathered face creased with amusement at my city clothes and obvious discomfort. "Your grandfather said you would come when the time was right," he told me in Swahili. "He said you have the gift, like him." I had no idea what gift he meant. My memories of grandfather were vague, his infrequent visits to Nairobi when I was a child, his gentle hands examining an injured bird I'd found, his stories of the savannah that had seemed fantastical to my young ears. I'd been raised by my mother, who rarely spoke of her father's life in the Mara. "What did my grandfather do out here?" I asked Thomas as we sat drinking tea that first evening. Thomas smiled mysteriously. "He healed. Animals came to him, and he tended their wounds." The Maasai called him Munganga wa Wanyama, the animal healer. I dismissed this as superstition, assuming my grandfather had simply been a local veterinarian of sorts. I planned to stay only long enough to sell the property 3 months, maybe 6 at most. But life has its own rhythm in the savannah, slower and more deliberate than city existence. Days turned to weeks, and I found myself postponing my return to Nairobi. My veterinary background proved useful almost immediately. A Maasai herder brought his sick goat to me within my first week. Word spread, and soon locals were bringing their livestock for treatment. I began walking the land, familiarizing myself with the surroundings, identifying plants my grandfather had cataloged in notebooks I found in his modest library. Many had medicinal properties, with handwritten notes on their applications for various animal ailments. 2 months into my stay, I encountered my first wild patient, a young zebra foal with a deep gash on its flank, likely from a predator it had narrowly escaped. The herd had moved on, leaving the weakened animal behind. Using techniques gleaned from my grandfather's journals and my own training, I treated the wound with a poultice of local herbs and cleaned it with filtered water. To my surprise, the foal allowed my approach with minimal resistance. After 2 days of treatment, the zebra's wound showed improvement, and on the 3rd morning, it had rejoined its herd, which inexplicably had returned to the area. Thomas witnessed this and nodded knowingly. "The gift awakens," he said simply. Over the following months, more wild animals appeared: a buffalo calf with a broken leg, an impala with an infected eye, a warthog with quills embedded in its snout. Each case built my confidence and deepened my connection to this land. I began to understand why my grandfather had chosen this isolated existence. There was purpose here, a calling that spoke to something primal within me. By my 2nd year, I'd established a routine. Mornings for collecting herbs and checking on recovering animals in my makeshift enclosures, afternoons for local livestock cases and maintaining the property, evenings for studying grandfather's journals and my own growing collection of notes. I still planned to return to Nairobi someday, but that day continuously receded into the future. The incident with Bahati began 3 days ago. I was gathering herbs near the southern boundary of my property when I heard a low, pained growl from a thicket of acacia. Approaching cautiously, I spotted him, an adult male lion, magnificent even in his weakened state, lying on his side. His breathing was labored, and a wound on his hindquarter oozed with infection. The area around the wound was swollen and discolored, suggesting the infection had been festering for days. Every instinct told me to retreat, contact the wildlife authorities, and let professionals handle it. But something in the lion's eyes, a glimmer of awareness, almost expectation, held me rooted to the spot. He watched me without aggression, his suffering evident in his labored breathing. I returned to my compound and radioed the wildlife service, but the nearest team was handling an elephant poaching incident miles away. They wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days. The lion likely wouldn't survive that long without intervention. Consulting grandfather's journals, I found entries about treating wounded lions. He'd written about a poultice specifically for deep infections, combining several native plants with powerful antimicrobial properties. I gathered the ingredients, prepared the mixture according to his instructions, and added a strong sedative I kept for large livestock. The approach would be the most dangerous part. Lions, even weakened ones, remain lethal predators. I prepared a long stick with a piece of meat secured to the end, the sedative embedded within. After an hour of patient coaxing, the lion finally consumed the offering. Once the sedative took effect, I worked quickly but thoroughly. The wound was worse than it had appeared, a deep puncture, likely from a buffalo horn, with secondary tears from the lion's own attempts to clean it. The infection had spread significantly. I cleaned the wound, applied the poultice, and administered a broad-spectrum antibiotic injection from my veterinary supplies. Throughout the procedure, I spoke softly to the sedated animal, a habit I'd developed with all my patients. I named him Bahati, Lucky One, in Swahili, though at that moment his luck seemed questionable at best. The entire treatment took nearly an hour, after which I retreated to a safe distance to monitor him as the sedative wore off. By evening, Bahati had regained consciousness but remained in place, too weak to move far. I left water nearby and withdrew to my compound. The following morning, I approached cautiously with fresh meat and additional medication. To my surprise, he accepted both the food and my presence, watching me with those intelligent eyes that seemed to communicate understanding. I treated him twice more that day, noting with satisfaction that the swelling had already begun to recede. By the third treatment, Bahati was alert enough to sit up, though still clearly in pain. I administered another dose of antibiotics and applied a fresh poultice before leaving him for the night. That brings me to this morning, standing frozen on my doorstep as dozens of lions stared back at me. The pride had come overnight, males, females, and several cubs forming a loose circle around my entire compound, with Bahati at the center. I had no weapon beyond a walking stick, no protection beyond the flimsy walls of my grandfather's house. Time seemed suspended as I stood motionless, scarcely breathing. The nearest lioness, a sleek female with a notched ear, sat barely 15 feet from me. Behind her, cubs wrestled in the grass while adolescent males paced with restless energy. Yet none approached. They simply watched, as if waiting. Bahati lifted his head weakly, his eyes finding mine across the distance. A low rumble emanated from his chest, not a growl of threat, but something else I couldn't identify. Several lionesses turned toward him, then back to me. The atmosphere vibrated with tension, with possibility, with something inexplicable. In that moment, standing surrounded by creatures that could end my life in seconds, I felt a profound connection to my grandfather and the gift Thomas had described. Whatever happened next would change my understanding of these animals and my place among them forever. My grandfather's journal mentioned a phrase the local Maasai used, "Kusikia na kuamini," listen and believe. Standing before the pride, those words echoed in my mind. I had dismissed many of his writings as embellishment or the mysticism of an isolated man. Now I wondered what other truths lay in those pages. Slowly, deliberately, I lowered myself to a crouch, maintaining eye contact with Bahati. The movement caused several lions to tense, but none advanced. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for my medical bag, which I'd left by the door. Inside were fresh bandages and more of the poultice I'd applied to Bahati's wound. "I need to check your wound, friend," I said softly. uncertain if using my voice would provoke the pride. To my astonishment, Bahati attempted to rise, wobbling on unsteady legs. A large male with a darker mane, likely the dominant male of the pride, growled low, causing Bahati to sink back down. The message seemed clear: stay put. The dominant male then looked at me, his expression inscrutable but somehow expectant. Taking a deep breath, I stepped forward, every movement measured and broadcast. The veterinary training had taught me to move confidently but calmly around large animals. With predators, eye contact should be intermittent enough to monitor, but not challenge. I kept these principles at the forefront of my mind as I closed the distance to Bahati. The pride shifted around me, creating a narrowing corridor between my hut and the injured lion. Cubs were shuffled behind mothers. Adolescents repositioned themselves, all maintaining a perfect distance. Close enough to strike if needed, far enough to observe. It felt choreographed, as if they'd done this before. Reaching Bahati, I knelt beside him, my back vulnerable to the lions behind me. It required every ounce of will to focus on the wound rather than the predators surrounding us. The infection had improved dramatically, the swelling reduced by half. I cleaned the area with fresh water from my canteen, applied the poultice, and wrapped a light bandage around his hind quarter. Throughout the procedure, Bahati remained perfectly still, his massive head resting on his paws, eyes half closed in what appeared to be relief. When I finished, I remained kneeling, uncertain what should come next. The dominant male approached, each footfall silent in the dusty soil. My muscles locked, instinct screaming to flee, while reason insisted any sudden movement would trigger a predatory response. He stopped less than 2 feet away, his muzzle level with my face. His breath was warm, carrying the metallic scent of a recent meal. Those amber eyes studied me with an intelligence I couldn't deny. Then, to my utter disbelief, he lowered himself to the ground, sphinx-like, watching me with what I could only interpret as approval. One by one, the other lions settled as well, creating concentric circles around Bahati, the dominant male, and me. It was as if some unspoken agreement had been reached. I was permitted to be here, to tend to their injured pride member. The tension in my body slowly uncoiled, replaced by wonder. For 3 hours, I remained with them, periodically checking Bahati's temperature and hydration. I retrieved water and leftover goat meat from my stores, placing them near him. The entire time, the pride observed but never threatened. Cubs eventually grew bored and played at the perimeter while mothers watched vigilantly. The scene was surreal, a human accepted, temporarily at least, into the presence of Africa's most formidable predators. When the sun reached its zenith, bringing midday heat, I knew I needed to return to shelter. Standing slowly, I backed toward my hut. The lions tracked my movement, but made no move to follow. Once inside, I collapsed onto a chair, adrenaline finally ebbing and leaving me shaking. Through my window, I continued watching the pride throughout the afternoon. They repositioned themselves into the shade of nearby acacia trees, but maintained their vigil around Bahati. By evening, I ventured out again to check his condition and was relieved to find his fever had broken. The wound was healing remarkably quickly, the combination of antibiotics, traditional medicine, and the lion's natural resilience working effectively. That night, I sat on my porch. The sounds of the pride, occasional grunts, cubs mewing, the shuffling of massive bodies strangely comforting in the darkness. I read my grandfather's journal by lamplight, searching for insights into what was happening. One entry stood out: "The lions came again today. This makes the 4th generation I have treated. They remember, these magnificent creatures. They pass knowledge through generations in ways we humans, with all our technology and language, have forgotten. They know who can help them. They choose to trust. And in that choice lies a wisdom we would do well to understand." I had assumed he was speaking metaphorically or documenting separate incidents with individual lions. Now I understood entire prides had sought him out, just as they now came to me. The revelation shifted something fundamental in my understanding of these animals and my connection to this land. The next morning, the dominant male was gone, along with several females and adolescents. Approximately half the pride remained, including Bahati, who looked remarkably improved. He was sitting up, alert, though still favoring his injured side. When I approached with fresh meat and medication, he accepted both willingly. By mid-morning, villagers had noticed the unusual gathering. 3 Maasai elders, including Thomas, arrived at the edge of my property, keeping a respectful distance. I walked out to meet them, aware of how bizarre the scene must appear, lions lounging peacefully around my compound as if they belonged there. "It is as your grandfather said," Thomas remarked, his expression a mixture of reverence and satisfaction. "The animals know the healer's blood." The elders had brought news. Word of the lions had spread, and a film crew from a wildlife documentary was already on their way from Nairobi. Additionally, conservation officials had been alerted and were dispatched to manage the situation. My heart sank at this. What was happening felt sacred, private, not something to be sensationalized or managed. "How long will they stay?" I asked Thomas, gesturing toward the remaining lions. "Until their brother is healed," he replied simply. "Or until outsiders disrupt the trust." I spent that day between two worlds, tending to Bahati and the unexpected pride around him, while simultaneously trying to contact various officials to ensure the lion's protection. By afternoon, a perimeter had been established a quarter-mile from my compound. Curious onlookers and a growing media presence were kept at this distance by rangers, though telephoto lenses captured images that would soon circulate worldwide. Dr. Elizabeth Kamau, head of Kenya Wildlife Services Veterinary Department and someone I'd briefly worked with in Nairobi, arrived with a small team. I'd expected skepticism or even censure for my unorthodox treatment of Bahati. Instead, she observed from a distance before approaching me privately. "I knew your grandfather," she said, surprising me. 20 years ago, when I was a student, most of my colleagues dismissed his methods as unscientific, but his results were undeniable. I've been following similar cases across the reserve for years. This isn't the only pride that seeks human assistance, though it's certainly the most dramatic instance I've documented. She showed me records of similar incidents, individual lions or small groups approaching specific Maasai compounds or research stations when injured. The pattern was consistent, but had never been officially acknowledged due to its inexplicable nature and the risk of encouraging unsafe human-wildlife interactions. "What you have here is extraordinary, Malik," she continued. "It represents a level of trust and intelligence in these animals that contradicts conventional understanding. I'd like to document this properly, scientifically, if you'll permit it." By evening, a small research team had set up equipment at a respectful distance, cameras to record the lion's behavior, medical instruments to properly document Bahati's recovery. The media had been restricted to brief, controlled access, though the story was already making headlines. "Lions seek human healer. Pride protects wounded brother at healer's compound." That night, I sat with Dr. Kamau and Thomas around a small fire, well away from the resting lions. The research team had confirmed what I'd observed. Bahati's infection was receding rapidly, his strength returning. At this rate, he would be able to travel within days. "Your grandfather documented 3 generations of this pride," Dr. Kamau told me, reviewing notes on her tablet. "The eldest females likely remember him. What's remarkable is that they've passed this knowledge to younger generations, that this specific location, your family, represents safety when they're vulnerable." "But how do they know?" I asked. "I've been here only 3 years. I never even met most of these lions before yesterday." Thomas smiled in the firelight. "The savannah has its own memory," he said, "and lions remember longer than men." As if in response, a soft roar echoed from where Bahati rested, followed by answering calls from the surrounding pride. In that moment, beneath the vast African sky filled with stars, I felt a connection to something ancient and profound, a wisdom that existed long before humans drew artificial boundaries between themselves and the natural world. The question that had haunted me since arriving that morning, "Why did they come?" now seemed both simpler and more complex than I had imagined. They came because they remembered. They came because, somehow, they knew. Dawn of the 3rd day brought subtle changes to the pride's behavior. The lions seemed more restless, occasionally standing to pace before settling again. Bahati was visibly stronger, able to stand and walk short distances without visible pain. The swelling around his wound had almost completely subsided, and the angry red infection had faded to a healing pink. Dr. Kamau arrived early, clipboard in hand, to document his progress. "His recovery is remarkable," she said, examining the wound through binoculars. "By all accounts, an infection that severe should have taken weeks to heal, not days." I thought of the poultice my grandfather had formulated, a combination of plants whose properties weren't fully documented in modern medicine. There was something to be studied there, a potential bridge between traditional knowledge and contemporary veterinary practice. "What happens when he's fully healed?" I asked, watching as Bahati stretched cautiously, testing his recovering muscles. "In typical cases, we'd expect the pride to move on, returning to their normal territory and hunting patterns," she replied. "But this situation is far from typical. I've been reviewing literature on lion behavior across Africa. There are scattered reports of similar incidents, prides bringing injured members to specific locations or individuals, but they're usually dismissed as anecdotal. No one has properly documented it until now." The research team had worked through the night, analyzing footage of the lions' interactions. They'd identified what appeared to be a complex social hierarchy within the pride, with specific lions designated as watchers or protectors around Bahati. The dominant male had returned before dawn, bringing a fresh kill that the pride shared near the edge of my property, a powerful demonstration of their acceptance of this temporary territory. Around mid-morning, a government vehicle arrived carrying Josephine Ndurangu, Kenya's Deputy Minister of Tourism and Wildlife. Her presence underscored the growing significance of what was happening. After a briefing from Dr. Kamau, she approached me, her expression a mixture of professional interest and personal wonder. "Mr. Ower, what you've accomplished here is extraordinary," she began. "But it also presents us with a unique challenge. This story has captured international attention. We're receiving inquiries from conservation organizations, research institutions, and media outlets worldwide." She gestured toward the perimeter where rangers continued to manage a growing crowd of onlookers. "Our immediate concern is the safety of both you and these lions. In the longer term, we need to consider how to study this phenomenon without exploiting it or creating dangerous precedents for human-wildlife interaction." I understood her concerns. The last thing anyone wanted was tourists or locals attempting to approach wild lions, expecting the same peaceful reception I'd experienced. What was happening here was exceptional, the result of generations of trust built between my family and this specific pride. "I believe we should document everything scientifically," I suggested, "but keep the exact location private. My grandfather managed to work with these animals for decades without publicity. Perhaps that's the better approach." Minister Ndurangu nodded thoughtfully. "A reasonable compromise. We'll establish this as a temporary research zone with restricted access. Dr. Kamau will lead the scientific documentation with a small team." By afternoon, the media had been provided with carefully selected footage and a joint statement from the Ministry and Wildlife Service. The narrative emphasized the exceptional nature of the event, the importance of trained professionals, and the ongoing research into lion intelligence and behavior. Most importantly, it stressed that the public should never approach wild lions under any circumstances. As the day progressed, I noticed Bahati watching me with increasing alertness. When I approached for his afternoon treatment, he stood completely, meeting my eyes with what seemed like purpose. The dominant male and several females also rose, creating what looked like a corridor between Bahati and the savanna beyond my property. Dr. Kamau observed this from nearby. "I think they're preparing to leave," she said quietly. "Bahati's showing all the signs of being ready to return to their territory." A bittersweet feeling washed over me. I'd grown attached to these magnificent creatures, to Bahati especially. His recovery represented something profound, not just the healing of his physical wound, but a connection to my grandfather's legacy and my own place in this landscape. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the savanna in gold and amber hues, Bahati approached me. The other lions remained alert but made no move to follow. He stopped a few feet away, his massive head level with mine as I knelt. For several heartbeats, we simply regarded each other, predator and healer, two beings connected by something beyond ordinary understanding. Then, with deliberate movement, he leaned forward until his forehead briefly touched my shoulder, a gesture so gentle and controlled it took my breath away. It lasted only seconds before he turned, walking with increasing confidence toward the waiting Pride members. Together, they moved toward the savannah, occasionally looking back until they disappeared into the lengthening shadows of acacia trees. Not all the lions left at once. Throughout the evening, small groups departed until, by nightfall, only a few remained, 2 females with cubs too young for a long journey. Dr. Kamau assured me they would likely move on within a day or two, once the cubs were rested. That night, the research team held a debriefing in my main room, laptops displaying data and footage collected over the past 3 days. The preliminary findings were fascinating evidence of coordinated behavior among Pride members, specific communication patterns when interacting near humans, and measurable stress hormones that were remarkably low given the unusual circumstances. There's enough material here for multiple research papers, Dr. Kamau said, reviewing her notes. But the most significant aspect may be the pharmacological properties of your grandfather's treatments. Would you be willing to share his formulations for analysis? I thought of the journals filled with knowledge accumulated over decades, on one condition, that any findings benefit conservation efforts and the local community. These remedies came from Maasai traditional knowledge that should be acknowledged and respected. Minister Ndurungu, who had stayed for the debriefing, nodded approvingly. We could establish a research center focused on traditional wildlife medicine, something that honors both the scientific and cultural aspects of this work. The conversation continued late into the night, possibilities expanding with each discussion. By morning, a framework had emerged, a proposal for a small, sustainable research facility on my property that would study wildlife behavior and traditional healing practices while training local community members in conservation. The remaining lions departed 3 days later, melting into the landscape with the same mysterious purpose that had brought them. The media attention gradually waned as newer stories captured public interest, though researchers continued to visit, setting up remote cameras in the surrounding area to monitor wildlife patterns. 1 month after Bahati's departure, Thomas arrived at my door, excitement visible in his usually composed features. "You must come," he insisted. "There is something you should see." He led me several miles into the reserve to a rocky outcropping that provided a view across a wide expanse of savanna. Through binoculars, I spotted them, Bahati's pride, including the healed male himself, thriving in their natural habitat. They had established territory remarkably close to my compound, though still maintaining a wild existence. "They have never stayed in this area before," Thomas explained. "Always they remained far to the north. Now they have claimed this land." Over the following months, a new pattern emerged. While the pride never again approached my compound en masse, individual lions occasionally appeared at the perimeter when injured or ill. Sometimes they brought younger pride members suffering from infections or wounds. Each time, I was permitted to approach, to treat, to heal, before they returned to their wild existence. Word spread among the Maasai communities, and elders from villages throughout the region came to share their knowledge of plants and animal behavior. My grandfather's journals were translated and digitized, creating an archive of traditional healing methods that complemented modern veterinary medicine. The research center became a reality, with funding from international conservation organizations. We built it using sustainable materials and traditional designs, creating a space that honored both scientific inquiry and cultural heritage. Local students received training and employment opportunities, while researchers from around the world contributed to growing knowledge about wildlife intelligence and behavior. 1 year after Bahati first appeared in the acacia thicket, I sat on my porch at sunset, reflecting on how completely my life had transformed. The city veterinary assistant had become something else, entirely part scientist, part traditional healer, a bridge between worlds that had too long been separated. Dr. Kamau joined me, having just completed another research visit. "We've identified 3 other locations in Kenya where similar phenomena have been documented," she said, "always near individuals with deep family histories of wildlife work, always with lions who've had positive human interactions over generations." "My grandfather wrote that animals remember longer than humans," I noted. "Perhaps what we're seeing is the outcome of generations of trust building." As darkness fell over the savannah, a familiar sound carried on the evening breeze, the deep, resonant roar of a male lion, followed by answering calls from his pride. I recognized Bahati's voice among them, strong and vital. "They're calling the younger ones home for the night," Dr. Kamau translated, smiling. In that moment, I understood with perfect clarity why they had come. Not just for healing, though that was part of it. They had come because, somewhere in their collective memory, they recognized that true coexistence was possible. That in this one small corner of an increasingly fragmented world, there existed a human who would meet them not with fear or dominance, but with respect and care. My grandfather had created that legacy, and now I continued it. In a world where human-wildlife conflict threatened so many species, this pride had offered a glimpse of another possibility, one where boundaries remained but were occasionally crossed with purpose and mutual benefit. As the stars emerged above the acacia trees, I silently thanked Bahati and his pride for the gift they had given me. Not just purpose or direction, but belonging. In saving him, I had found my place in the ancient rhythm of the savannah, continuing a tradition that stretched back through generations of my family and forward into a future where humans and wildlife might find new ways to share our increasingly fragile planet.